You're listening to Impulse to Innovation. The Institution of Mechanical Engineers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Helen MaaS. As a global community of mechanical engineers with over 120,000 members in 140 countries, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers has been at the heart of the engineering profession since 1847. The institution's mission is to improve the world through engineering by sharing the latest news, views and insight into the creative world of technology and the people that make it happen. With the recent acceleration of technologies such as IoT, cloud computing and big data, people and goods have become more connected than ever. In response to this increasing availability of data and digital services, the transport sector is undergoing a sizeable transformation as a result of the growing need for more sustainable and accessible travel solutions. This has stimulated a considerable amount of research aimed at improving the connectivity of transport infrastructure and services, developing new business models that package different modes and services together into one mobile application or online platform to make the planning and payment of trips easier for people and businesses. Such innovation has been termed Mobility as a Service, or MaaS, and it was outlined in the UK government's report Future of Mobility Urban Strategy 2019, which aimed to help urban areas harness the benefits and opportunities of new transport innovations. MaaS platforms integrate and analyse data from transport systems such as rail, buses, taxis, and even cycle hire to offer the user a choice in journey planning. The concept of MaaS is to make journeys more convenient through streamlining planning and payment and allowing people to tailor journeys to their specific needs. In its drive to meet decarbonisation and net zero ambitions, the UK government produced a Code of Practice for Mobility as a Service in 2023. This comprehensive framework focuses on convenience, accessibility and innovation to ensure that modern mobility apps meet the needs of the public. Indeed, the main objective is to make transport options accessible to all, paving the way for an interconnected, user-centric transport ecosystem. But how effective would such a system be in the UK? What impact would MaaS have globally, particularly in remote locations and low-income economies? And is the transport industry really ready to integrate this level of digital interconnectivity into its services? To answer these and other questions about MaaS, I spoke with Dr. Kate Pangborn, Associate Professor of Transport Governance at the Institute of Transport Studies at Leeds University, and Sharon Kindlysides, Transport Engineer and Board Member of the European Logistics Association, to get their views on what implications it might have for the UK transport sector, the impact it could have on society in terms of accessibility and cost, and what challenges its implementation might have on the UK and beyond. Kate Pangborn joined the Institute of Transport Studies in 2016 and is now an interdisciplinary researcher with an academic background spanning social and environmental sciences, humanities and computer science. She is currently the governance theme lead for the Multi-Institutional Energy Demand Research Centre, co-lead of the ITS Social and Political Science Research Group, and a deputy director of the Leeds Social Science Institute. Her work on transport governance and smart mobility investigates the power relations, structures, scales and processes involved in strategic vision and implementation of transport policy. Kate is also a former chair of the Transport Geography Research Group of the Royal Geographical Society and an associate editor of the Journal of Transport Geography. Sharon Kindlysides is a global expert in transport and future mobility and boasts more than 19 years leadership experience in the sector, including previous roles as ITS Director for Transport in New South Wales and CEO of CAPS Trafficcom Limited, She also served a tenure as chair of the Intelligence Transport Systems in the UK, as well as being a past CEO of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. And she is now a board member of the European Logistics Association. Sharon has an honours degree in manufacturing systems engineering from the University of the West of England and an MBA from the University of Durham. Sharon, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. Thank you for joining me.
No, my absolute pleasure. I'm looking forward to this.
It's going to be wonderful to talk to you because I know it's been a while since you and I have spoken, particularly around transport.
Yes.
So let's get right into the weeds, shall we? As someone who's spent most of her engineering career in the transport industry, what's your take on the government's ambition for integrated transport and specifically for MaaS?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. And as all politicians would say, I'm really glad you asked me that. The government, all governments of all flavours are acknowledging the fact we need sustainable transport and we need to ideally get people thinking more about how they travel, taking low carbon approaches. And really the idea behind mobility as a service, or MaaS, is to make that as seamless and easy as possible. And the holy grail is one app, one ticket, one payment.
Right.
And obviously that does require integrated transport. I think somehow that maybe simplifies it a bit because not everybody has journeys that are simple. And a lot of people make the same journey, 3 times a week, 2 times a week, and they know what they're doing. So really, I think where MaaS fits in is particularly in a sort of a middle ground of people that are making occasional journeys to new locations. But the idea of the integrated ticketing or the integrated transport behind that is key. You don't want to have to be faffing around trying to work out who to pay, what to pay, when to pay. So I think the principle is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We need to be integrated, but I think some of the detail, as you say, some of the weeds maybe needs looking into. And in particular, what works for a Manchester, a Birmingham or a London doesn't work freely where I live with 23,000 people.
We've sort of got a start on it, haven't we? I went to London yesterday and I went onto the local train services website and I was able to buy a ticket, not just from their train line, but from others. So the railway industry is kind of getting there, or is there more to do in order to connect it to things like buses and taxis and things like that?
There's a lot of good stuff going on, and I'd like to give a quick shout out to Plus Bus. Quite often when you go and buy your train ticket, I actually bought a single from London to Cambridge, Ely yesterday, and it gave me the offer of getting the Plus Bus on it. So I think there's a lot to be done there. Just the option of saying, would you like a bus ticket at the other end? Yeah. Just gives you that bit of encouragement. If you're buying it with your train ticket, you don't have to think twice.
Yeah.
You may have problems, particularly at the other end, finding a bus, but that's a whole other issue. That's where the transport planners come into it. So I think there are pockets that are really good. And as I say, I think particularly it's making sure the information's readily available, and it doesn't all have to be on an app. I frequently get off a train and then the first thing I do is look at the town map to work out, can I walk? Do I need to take a bus? And I still quite like big visible maps because I can see everything at once rather than having it on my screen. But I've always got my journey planner app to fall back on, and everybody's got their favourite mapping app they like to use. Yeah. And I've been really pleased to see recently that fare data has started to be included. Google Maps has actually got underground and bus fare information for London on it. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of local authorities' bus apps are starting to include fare information. So I think telling people how much it costs as well is really useful, because if you don't know, you're a bit nervous and it's like, well, how do I pay? How much should I pay? So I think this starting to include fare information is vital. And, I'm a transport professional and I didn't know the difference in prices in London, and what hope has anybody else got?
Yeah, absolutely. Mobility as a service it's kind of being touted really as a kind of the new hope. Mm. In terms of the opportunity to bring in new business models for transport operation, how do you see the operators in the UK adopting and integrating this government vision for MaaS?
That again is really interesting. I think in areas where we've got a large ridership, it's a lot easier. just because if you've got 1 million people traveling a day, it's a lot easier. The cost benefit is a lot easier to prove. So I think it definitely segregates, and I'll go back to the use cases. There are use cases when MaaS is absolutely brilliant, and it's for those less common journeys. If you get off the plane somewhere, the easiest thing for you to do is to go on your app and find out, okay, I'm at Luton, I'm at Heathrow, I'm at Stansted, how do I get to X?
Yeah.
For me, going into London 3 times a week, I sort of know what I'm doing. And all I need to know is if my train's running on time, and I just go on the train app for that. Would it be easier if everything was all in one place? Possibly, but I know where to go because I travel a lot. So it's this thing about the occasional traveller, or you've got to go to a hospital, say, that you don't go every year. So I think it's really for those journeys, and reassuring people and encouraging them to use public transport where they might have used a car is sort of particularly where I see the modal shift happening. And it's a longer spectrum. Operators obviously want as many people as possible on their vehicles. Great, don't we all? Yeah. But you'd also like to know, is my train or my bus going to be absolutely full at this time? Shall I go 5 minutes later? So I think we've got to look at what do the passengers want and what do the users want. And as an engineer, we are famous for inventing stuff and then telling people they need to use it. We do.
Absolutely.
I think the only people who are worse than us are architects, and any architects listening, I apologise. No, we can't build it like that. But we are really very, very, very good at inventing lovely, shiny stuff. And in passenger transport, the one thing we need to be doing is listening to the users. Particular cases are, there is a limited number of wheelchair spaces on a bus. Yeah. If you're leaving home and you're wheeling somewhere, you need to know that you can get on that bus. Trains are not, we have assistance, but even that sometimes breaks down. So what is it the users need to know to give them the confidence? And actually, how do we give that to them in a way they can use it, which is what mobility as a service should be doing. It's not necessarily getting from A to B. It's everything you do in advance before you leave your house. So I see it as being much, much wider and not just about the trip. And I think, my plea to operators and local authorities and governments is think about your user. I'm sure the Sinclair C5 was a brilliant means of transport, just nobody really wanted it. It was great. So we need to do the same with the apps, make sure it's something people want rather than what we think they want. So ask the questions, what do you use a passenger want, and think of all the use cases. As I say, I live in rural East Anglia. We have a lot of children that travel, when they go to sixth form, they tend to go to Cambridge, so we've got a whole bunch of 16, 17, 18-year-olds going on trains and buses probably for the first time. What do they need? Yeah. What do my parents living in wildest Norfolk need? So it's all the use cases. And I think us in the middle that are working and fit and able and digitally capable probably shouldn't be the target group for this as much as we're the ones that everybody aims at.
I was going to say that, I think for many years, and I think the transport industry would put their hands up to this, I'm sure, but for many years, the demographic, I suppose, has been the commuter, hasn't it? The person going to and from work. And we've often forgotten about, as you rightly mentioned there, people with disabilities, but also mothers with pushchairs, with a little child in tow, being able to get on and off a bus, being able to find the right transport and to know that they can access that transport. We've often forgotten about them. And older people particularly, I mean, we've now got a much more ageing population. And I know we're going to talk about the issues of rural and city kind of variants, but there are more older people living in rural communities who need access to this. So operators have really got to start thinking about the user case. Who are these people that are going to benefit from something like MaaS? And I think you make a great point there.
Yeah. And what I'd also say as well is one of the common complaints, particularly about buses, is that they don't run on time. And some of it's actually for a good reason. If you've got 15 people getting on at a bus stop rather than 2, it takes longer to load. If you're, say, outside a hospital and you're waiting longer because you've got people with, varying levels of mobility, again, if we know that, we can plan it into the timetable. Nobody, let the bus sit there for 5 minutes if you know you're going to have to load a lot of people or it takes longer. If you've got to stop like the one on Lynn Road near me, you might only have a couple of passengers. But I'd also like to see responsive planning and actually taking that to account, so you're not setting yourself impossible targets. Because the thing that turns people off, and I know bus data's whole issue in itself, is if your timetable is already impossible to meet because you're loading so many more passengers, look at it, and then just give the accuracy, because if I know my app is accurate, I will use it.
Yeah.
If I know the bus will come, I will use it. If I'm slightly worried or I'm running late, I might get a cab or I might jump in my car.
Yeah. If the only information that you're getting is the definitive time that it says on the timetable, that's not realistic, is it? And
No.
There are examples where I think in Sheffield, for example, the trams have a display which tells you where it is at the next stop, and how long it's going to be. So we need to be translating that kind of information, that real-time information, don't we, to enable people to make the right decisions for the sorts of transport they need to use.
Yeah, and a lot of the public transport apps actually show you that, which is really, really good, and the real-time bus information. But, it's how you roll it out more widely, how you make it accessible. Yeah. And, it's not practical on every bus stop in the country to have real-time information. Some of the rural stops won't even have electricity. So it's how do we work around that? I quite like on the London bus stops, you can text and it tells you when your next bus is coming. Right. And actually, I find that really useful, because it's just, quick, you text it, it says, these are the buses that are coming. Yeah. Something like that is relatively simple to implement. And, even if you've only got a more basic phone, texting something and getting text back is a fairly low-tech solution.
Yeah. And not just for the UK, but for internationally.
Anywhere, yes.
As we're going to be talking about. Now, transport accounts for around 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it's estimated to account for almost a quarter of emissions in Europe alone. Improving our transport systems is essential, isn't it, if we're going to address the climate crisis? But in many remote areas around the world, people just don't have access to public transport networks. So how are we going to address that? And what kind of things could more affluent countries such as the UK do to support the development of transport systems around the world?
Wow. I mean, this could be an all-day podcast in its own right. I mean, it is difficult, and the other side of it is we really don't want to be seen as being, here we are, we're going to tell you how to run your transport networks. Particularly the UK has particularly bad history in going around the world telling people what to do. So I think some of it's education, being open and keen to share our information, but also thinking, particularly when we're doing something, and particularly with vehicles, as vehicles age, they sort of get passed down, from the big shiny bus fleet to local. And then quite a lot of the time, these older vehicles end up outside the UK. So when we're looking at designing vehicles, how can we make sure that they don't suddenly, at the age of 12 years or 15 years, just suddenly pack up and no one can fix them? So what would benefit everybody along the vehicle line particularly is thinking, okay, this vehicle is going to have multiple lifespans. How do we make sure it's extendable and we don't suddenly end up with a bus or a minibus with a battery you can't replace? Yeah. But I think a lot of it's this knowledge sharing, and particularly institutions like IMechE, CILT, CIHT, IET, get them all named here. But, we've all got international communities. Yeah. And let's make sure that when we're talking about an event, a sustainability event, we make sure we're sharing it as wide as possible. And, and particularly with the international membership, a lot of these young students are coming over here and learning and then going back. So how do we support them in their home countries? But it's really keen that, you don't come up with a solution that doesn't work. Yeah. We see particularly in Africa how, the sort of the phone network and mobile banking, they were ahead because it was a lot easier to do banking on a phone. Yeah. So we've got things to learn from them. But I would just say share knowledge as widely as possible. Don't be condescending. We don't know it all. And just support all these young engineers who come here or come, to Europe to study when they go back to their home countries, Just because they're a couple of thousand miles away, you can still invite them to seminars and panels. You can still talk at their seminars and panels. So this knowledge sharing, but also we don't all know the answers. A thing that's going to work in Britain may not work anywhere else.
Yeah, true. And you're rightly saying, this is a great opportunity to bring the international engineering community to bear on what is a problem for every nation, I suppose, isn't it? Is how do we get from A to B? And not just, I suppose, moving people as well, but moving materials and cargo has just the same problems, and making sure we've got an effective means of transport, that we're not creating huge amounts of CO2 is clearly going to be something that engineers are going to be working on for a while.
And particularly, freight, I've got an interest in freight, and that's even more affected by the geographies. And I worked in Australia for a year, and just the sheer distances, you've got to have a solution that is place-based.
Yeah.
Whatever your place is, think first your solution has got to fit your local place. And if you start from that basis, it's a good place to start. Don't just say, I've seen that in wherever, Montreal, Vancouver, Madrid. Go, actually, my place is, it looks like this, my problems are this. How do I solve it?
Yeah. I mean, that leads on to quite a nice question, really, about technologies, the sorts of technologies that are being developed. And you've talked very broadly about the apps that are available and the digital side of this. What sort of technologies are we going to see kind of integrated into this MaaS world, as it were? And what changes as users are we likely to see in coming years?
One of the things I'm the biggest proponent of is really crowd shared data and using multiple data sources. So it doesn't just have to be that one piece of data you've got. You can incorporate it into a whole raft of things. And particularly for doing demand management, I mean, obviously we always have roadworks already. People know about big football events, concerts, but using crowdsourced data, the stuff that's generated off your mobile phone, off the phone networks, starting to analyze that more so you've got a bigger picture. And I mean, the common thing, particularly with buses, well, with anything, is origin and destination. I only know as a bus operator or a train operator where you got on. As a bus operator, I don't know where you got off. As a train operator, I've got a chance of knowing where you got off. You hope. But if I am a town planner or a city planner, I want to know where are you going afterwards? Where have you come from? Yeah. Because it may be you're crossing over a dual carriageway to go to a cinema, say. If I don't know that, I could have put the bus stop, 20 metres further back. But it's the whole, I've forgotten what the proper transport planning term is, but it's the thing of the attraction that you're travelling to. Yeah. And also being aware, particularly post-COVID, how we travel has completely changed. Leisure journeys are more important. People commute, but they're commuting on different days of the week. It's that constant change. And there was a bit of a joke I made during COVID that we'd put all our traffic light monitoring systems in based on people commuting, and now they're all going to the supermarket instead. So we had all our adaptive traffic control on the wrong routes. I mean, It was a bit facetious, but things change that massively. You may even not be looking at the right thing. You may want to monitor something different. So looking forward, I would love to see much, much more data analytics going on. AI is a buzzword, but I just think it's looking at the data and using the data and being responsive, and just what happened last year is not going to happen this year. Yeah. Regardless what the year is. So I think it's just being more flexible. And it's incredibly hard if you're planning a transport system. You're not making up the schedules the day before. You've got to have the staff, you've got to have the rostering, and then somebody opens a new warehouse or a factory, and suddenly you've got 5,000 people working somewhere you weren't expecting them, say. Yeah. So you've got to get public transport in. So I think it's that use of data and looking wider. And there's been some really good examples. And I'd like to call Kent out for this. They're brilliant, and they've been using some money from DFT, and they've also worked with Amazon to make sure their rapid bus network works for people working at Amazon as well, and also in the Northeast with Nissan. So it's look at the bigger picture. Yeah. Think again, it's back to the user. Why is your user traveling? And I think data just gives us this chance to understand more about where they're going and why they're going and what they're doing. So let's just embrace it. It's there. We've just got to unpick it and work out what it all means.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of AI is often kind of bandied around. In this particular case, the opportunity to predict and forecast changes in the movement of passengers is going to be really key, isn't it, to this problem? And as engineers, being able to look at the data and understand where we might in the future need to put technology to monitor the movement of passengers, it is going to be key. So we're going to need to use that kind of artificial intelligence, that machine learning, to make those predictions in the future. But in the meantime, as engineers, we need to be able to make sure our technology is flexible, don't we?
Yeah, and responsive. And also, I mean, engineers are really good at sort of planning stuff and then thinking it's going to stay the same.
Yeah.
And particularly with transport, you've almost got to have your backbone that will be fixed. It might be trams, it might be trains, and then feed in the local transport, but be ready to be flexible with the local transport.
Yeah. So there's a real need for systems approaches to this, isn't there? This is a perfect systems engineering problem to be solved before we even get to these wonderful apps and all of these other things. It sounds like there's quite an exciting future for engineers in solving this problem.
No, I think there is. And certainly, when I do careers talks, we're always going to need to travel. I don't know how you're going to travel. I don't know where you're going to travel. But we're always going to need to travel.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this already, Sharon, in terms of accessibility for a broader range of the population. But making public transport more accessible and affordable can have a profound effect, can't it, on individuals, on families, on communities as a whole. And it improves not just their ability to move around, but the economic opportunities that they have, their health and their overall quality of life. But we still have a big issue with transport in rural areas, don't we? And I know that this is something that you're very passionate about. And this is not just a problem that the UK have. This is a global issue. And it results in a disproportionate socioeconomic kind of issues that arise from that between cities and rural communities. Is something like MaaS going to solve that divide, or are we going to need to consider a range of solutions in the long term? This is just one aspect of a bigger picture, if you like.
No, I think it is going to be one of the aspects, and we need to accept the fact that some transport routes are what we'd call socially necessary ones. They're never going to be profitable, and they do need to be looked after by subsidies or by overall planning and looking at the transport system as a holistic way. MaaS can certainly give you the information so that you are aware of it and of what's available. And certainly there's a lot of work going on in demand responsive transport at the moment, which is, the old version was dial-a-ride, but it's sophisticated dial-a-ride. But again, the economics are difficult. So I think MaaS is going to be one of the tools in the box.
Yeah.
And it's certainly going to be when we've got the data. It's going to be when we're looking at what should our networks do, what connectivity do we do. It's going to feed into that. But I think we still need, there's two sides of it. We still need people in the rural areas to feel confident that when we say a bus is going to come, it's going to come, or a minibus or whatever it is. We've got to build that confidence. We've got to make sure the buses are going when people want and where people want.
Yeah.
And as I say, my commuting children in East Anglia, it tends to be the mums or the dads that drive them into Ely to get them to station so they can get on the train to Cambridge. Yeah. I'm exaggerating, but looking at these use patterns to make sure that, if you can only afford to run 6 services a day, when should they be? And don't forget, actually, if you're 16, 17, 18, you do want to go to the cinema or a pub on a Friday or a Saturday night. You don't want to live in your beautiful village like a hermit. You want to see your friends.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's being really realistic about why people travel. And MaaS definitely is going to give people the confidence that the bus is going to come, or the minibus or the DRT. But we've got to look at it in the range of other things. And when you're planning, plan for your county, your area as a whole. And Transport East just last week released their paper on rural transport, and they're one of the subnational transport bodies. And they're looking very much, and I think Transport North are as well, becoming centres of excellence for rural travel.
Okay.
Because everyone's got their own issues, we've got market towns, we've got coastal towns. Northumberland has got, just large amounts of rural areas. So I think it's really great that some of these authorities are taking it on themselves to become the centre of excellence and share the knowledge. But we need to work together to see what works, what doesn't, and what might work in one area. I mean, we've got a road here that floods massively and has spent most of the last 6 weeks underwater. You've got to build resilience in as well, because not all, but a lot of rural areas, the roads are smaller. They might be less well maintained. They might be more inclined to flood or whatever. So we've got to build the resilience in as well that says, if the Walney Road is closed, how do you get to school?
Yeah.
So, and I know cities have their challenges as well. And, it's not just the rural areas, but we've got to look at everything, and particularly resilience is key, especially as we're having more extreme weather events.
Yeah.
So, it's so many things to think about. It's not even a Rubik's Cube. It's one of those hexagonal ones, I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm very much like you. I live in rural Lincolnshire, and we have buses come through the village, but I live in a very small village. There's no shops or anything like that. So everything that you do here has to be done by transport, whether that's a car, particularly by bus. So having that ability to be able to get from here to Lincoln and to train stations and other things often results in you using a car more than anything, because it's the most convenient thing. So we do need to be looking at, as you rightly say, the opportunities to enable people to use public transport rather than using their own private transport. I would hope that this would be one of many solutions that can enhance people's way of life in rural communities.
Yeah, no, very much. And if you look at cars and car usage, we don't expect one type of car to be suitable for everybody. So when we're looking at public transport, why on earth do we think one sort of public transport will fit everybody?
That's such a good point. It is. We design buses in the same way, and we have done for centuries, I suppose. But we do need to have transport that's different, that enables people to use it in different ways. And I think that's a great point that you make.
Yeah, and I've seen, people might want to take a bike on the bus. Well, do we need a trailer? Do we need a bike rack at the front or the back? Obviously, we talked about buggies and wheelchairs. You're going to have your muddy boots on. You're going to have your kids. You're going to have your shopping. You're going to have your suitcase. Yet buses predominantly are quite narrow, and you face forwards, and there's nowhere to put anything.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
All the luggage storage there is. And my other one, while I've got the microphone, is if you are expecting people to go shopping on the buses, why not have some luggage storage so that they can actually, you can only say carry 3 bags at once. But if you wanted to go to the clothes shop and the supermarket and the chemist or whatever, you need to be able to come back somewhere to store it while you go around and then pick it all up and get on the bus together, rather than have to carry it all around at once.
That's a very good idea. I mean, we have mentioned Amazon before, but they have those storage lockers, don't they, where you can pick up parcels. But being able to kind of leave your belongings somewhere and be able to go elsewhere, would make a big difference to some people, wouldn't it? Yeah. In large European cities, almost 7 in 10 people can reach their city centre in less than 30 minutes, compared to just 4 in 10 in UK cities outside of London. This kind of poor urban transport is costing the UK, from what I understand, £23 billion a year in lost economic activity. So how can we best address the UK's urban transport problem? I mean, we've talked an awful lot about the rural issues, but cities still struggle, don't they? Is there an opportunity for us to kind of follow a European model here, or do we have to manage our cities in the UK because they're just so old and big and have been constructed in a way that doesn't really sit with public transport these days?
I mean, it's very interesting. And I've lived in Vienna and I've lived in Sydney. The figure that 70% of people live within 30 minutes of the city centre seems quite high. And I know a lot of particularly European cities have got a lot of these sort of taller tenement blocks centrally. I suppose it depends why people are going into the city centre. Are people going in for work, or are they going in for shopping? If I was going to go into Cambridge, I'd be going in for shopping probably. So I think it probably gets back to the use patterns and post-COVID. And I also think Brits just commute further. We like living somewhere that's maybe's got a garden, whereas a lot of the European lifestyle is flat. I know a lot of people in London live in flats, and a lot of people in Europe live in houses with gardens. But a 30-minute commute for me sounds positively quick.
I think we're a little biased though, aren't we, Sharon, because of the nature of where we live? Because I would agree with you. You know, a 30-minute journey for me is kind of nothing. You know, it takes me 40 minutes to get to Newark Station.
Yeah, it takes me 25 to walk to Ely Station. So, and I know 15-minute cities got embroiled in all manner of contention and stuff like that. But it's, what do we want? I think. Do I want to be able to get into a big city in half an hour? No, I've chosen not to. I've chosen to live rurally. Do the people that live in cities want to have their services near them? Or do they want better transport to get to centralised services? And I think I've seen a lot, particularly as places in London, when I've walked around London, are developing, there definitely seems to be going for these, you'll build some houses of mixed use, and then you have some supermarkets and things. So I think a lot of it's about land planning and use. And yes, we've got a lot of big old cities that have merged together and people are coming in from the suburbs. But I think it's as much about making sure you've got the facilities you need near you for the everyday living. Yeah, you're not going to want to go and buy a ball gown locally. You would go into the city for that, or you might go and do your Christmas shopping somewhere else. But you want, your supermarket, your chemist, your basics locally. So I think it gets back to, where are we living? Where are we working? What do we want to do what do we want to do in our neighbourhood? Yeah. And I mean, European cities are great. Public transport over there is wonderful. Vienna is brilliant. Sydney was pretty good. I was going on a double-decker train to work, which was just fantastic. But even then, I was living in the suburbs, and that was a good 50 minutes. And coming home in the evening on the slow train is an hour and 20. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's making sure you've got what you need locally, so your basics aren't difficult to access, and the stuff that you would make a special trip for anyway. I think, if you want to go to Leicester Square to go to the cinema, or you want to go to a museum, you'd probably make a bit of a day of it and make the trip part of the day out.
Yeah. So again, it comes back to what you were saying right at the beginning of this, that we've got to understand what people want from their environment, and that's really going to dictate what we as engineers do.
Absolutely.
I'm interested to get your thoughts on the government's new code of practice, which has recently come out. I think it came out at the end of last year on MaaS. And do you think that they've got overly excited about this as an opportunity, or do you think that there's some real drive and motivation from government to start to implement this as a real solution to transport problems in the UK?
I'm actually very happy when the government looks at transport. I'm really pleased it's moved up the agenda. We've had the autonomous vehicles, we've had MaaS, there's been a set of bus announcements recently. There's been about 5 or 6 big transport announcements. I am happy that the spotlight is getting on transport. The detail we can all fight about, but I'm just more happy it's being looked at and considered. I would much rather that happened than it was completely ignored. I've sometimes compared autonomous vehicles with being a bit like a fashion show. Some of the outrageous clothes you see at a fashion show you would never wear, but that colour or that ruffle or that buckle or that button does stick. So I think with a lot of these government announcements, actually, if some of it happens, that's good for me. I'd just rather it was in the spotlight and people were talking about it. I mean, again, sometimes it gets in the spotlight for the wrong reason, but who was it said that no publicity is bad publicity?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think if we're talking about this, if we're actually sharing our views and our thoughts and gaining insight from what society needs, then actually it's better to be on the agenda, isn't it? Rather than just be kind of in the background.
Yeah, and in a run-up to an election, whatever colour government we have next year, it's there, it's being talked about, and I'd like to see, let's carry on the conversation.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great opportunity for engineers in the future across all aspects of transport and indeed all aspects of engineering, because it will need all of us to address these problems, as you've rightly pointed out today. I think there's some great opportunities for the future. Sharon, thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast. It's been a real pleasure to hear all about this very interesting subject and your excitement and passion for the opportunities that it offers us. Thank you.
No, thanks, Helen. I've really enjoyed it.
Kate, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show. I wanted to start by asking you about your work at the Institute for Transport Studies at Leeds University, and particularly on your thoughts about mobility, transport infrastructure and services, given the way that we can collect and analyse data these days.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, Helen. It's a really great pleasure to have been asked to do this. So just to give you a bit of background, I'm a social and interdisciplinary scientist, and I have a background that encompasses a first degree in humanities, an MSc in sustainable rural development, in which I developed skills varied across wildlife economics, environmental impact assessment, and rural and regional planning, among other things. So, but that is where my interest in transport sustainability and decarbonisation was really sparked. And I did a PhD in the geography of transport governance in Scotland. So I then moved to the Institute of Transport Studies in 2016 as a principal investigator of my own project, investigating persuasive messaging for mode shift. And I've continued my research focus in transport governance and travel behaviour change ever since, because technologies that use data are ubiquitous in our lives now, if not quite all pervasive. That's a difficult word. And transport is a sector that can benefit really greatly from data science in relation to understanding the dynamic nature of travel patterns and behaviours, in addition to the support that digitalisation and the data it generates actually gives to transport operations, for example, of the rail network or in traffic management. However, I should add, I'm not a data scientist.
Right, okay, fair enough. What you've clearly pointed out there is that this is not just an engineering problem, is it? This encompasses so many aspects of science and sociology and understanding geography and all of those things, as you rightly mentioned. So given the nature of what we're talking about today, this really isn't just about engineering a solution. This is about bringing everyone together on this problem.
Absolutely right, Helen. It's a really complex system that encompasses our engineering solutions, our technologies, people, and how they are somewhat unpredictable. There's been a lot of transport modelling that's been based on predicting what people are going to do and forecasting trends, and that worked for a while. But I think what we've seen repeatedly over the years is that the outturn from actual patterns is different to the forecasts. And now we've most recently had the severe disruption from the pandemic, and that experience has made some really quite noticeable changes in travel behaviour, which we're still trying to understand in full because it's dynamic. We're trying to observe a dynamic system, and we're trying to make improvements, whether they're engineering or policy or pricing, to systems which are in constant flux and connected one with another. And it's really hard to unpack what the unanticipated impacts might be of making a change in any one part of that system.
Yeah, I mean, you touched there on COVID, and I guess that was a real blip for the transport industry, and something that we've never experienced before. So there was no precedent set. We got no data that would enable us to predict behaviours at that point. And I guess that's going to be something that people like yourself and other people in the transport industry are going to be studying for years, aren't they, really, to understand and be able to model that in the future in case it happens again.
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot of us, just as general human beings, would quite like to forget all about it.
Of course, yeah.
But and never mention the COVID word again. But in transport, we can't do that. it's been a severe shock to the system, and we're just going to have to grit our teeth and continue to try and understand what's happened as a result of that, and what's continuing to happen.
It's fascinating. I guess we could spend the next half an hour just talking about that. But I wanted to go back a little way to 2019, and the government published its Future of Mobility report on how it envisaged technology would impact transport and its hopes for a more integrated network, particularly using new technologies. And we started to hear this term mobility as a service. So can you tell our listeners or give us a broad overview, if you like, of what mobility as a service or MaaS is, and how does it differ from our existing transport models?
In some ways, it's easier to say what mobility as a service isn't.
Right.
But I will do my best. So mobility as a service is something that's been on my personal research agenda since the term was first coined actually around 2014. Okay. And it actually originates with a master's thesis in Finland. Right. At least that is the generally accepted history. At that time, I was working on a European project called MyWay that was describing itself as a holistic journey planner that incorporated some sort of disruption, rerouting, and had the aspirations to incorporate booking and paying for multiple modes, and it was going to deliver multimodal journey plans. Essentially, it included many of the features that we associate with mobility as a service now, but we didn't have the term, so it wasn't called that because this project started in, 2012 or 2013, something like that. So, towards the end of that project, in the circles, the mobility as a service term was starting to be bandied about. It had quite a long gestation before government in the UK picked up on it, to be honest. Right. But it's also part of a continuum of terminology changes. So, most of your listeners probably are familiar with some of the older terminology, such as integrated transport systems, and the long history of that as a sort of key aspiration for making it easier for people to make multimodal journeys. So that private car use can be reserved for trips that really can't be met effectively in any other way. Yeah. For example, many rural journeys are really hard to serve by public transport. So intelligent transport systems and also the term smart mobility are terms in the same broad domain, but they reflect the emerging role at the time that these terms came about of digitalization and data in relation to transforming transport. And in the case of smart mobility, which is a slightly vague term, it also embraces innovative transport services such as the sort of various modes that we describe as micro-mobility, things like e-scooters, where we've got some trials in the UK because they are otherwise illegal as road vehicles, or city bike share schemes, whether those are standard pedal your own bike or electric assist. Those both sort of fall under that sort of heading of micro-mobility. And also smart mobility takes us all the way up to the sort of connected and autonomous vehicle technologies that are also being pursued quite assertively at the moment. We can also include electric vehicles under that heading because increasingly there is a need for software and data, for example, around the charging networks that are needed for electric vehicles. So that also is an innovation that can be brought into the smart mobility domain. And then, of course, it can go off into the smart energy grid as well in terms of things that are beyond the scope of this particular discussion. So mobility as a service is a related development to these things, and it's dependent on integration and dependent on intelligence, but it's not the same. So essentially, it's not really a service that provides mobility, but it's more of a platform that provides access to mobility services.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a technology project, that needs sort of an API, for example, to link the various providers of the transport services themselves, or potentially other related services such as parking or hotel bookings that you might want to make along with your journey. Even food deliveries, if you don't actually want to make a journey, that could all be incorporated into a mobility as a service platform in theory. The APIs link the services to the platform, and then the end users can gain access to those services through the interface. But in between that, there's a sort of back-end service from the mobility as a service platform provider, which has that's where all the magic happens algorithmically, in terms of what then gets presented to the end user, you and me, through the interface on your smartphone or your computer in response to your request to explore a potential trip.
Right, okay.
So this starts with the basic sort of map-based trip planning of the origin destination sort of pair that you've requested, and maybe any intermediate stops, like on Google Maps, for example. If you need petrol, you can put an intermediate stop, and you can do a little search for petrol stations that are on your route, and then you can set one of them as an intermediate stop. So that kind of principle. And then depending on the design of the interface, users might have a registered profile where they've set some preferences and their general needs, or they could be guest users.
Right.
And there may be some limitations as to what you can do if you're a guest user rather than a registered user. So then you should be able to select one of the presented journey plans and then make all the ticket bookings and payments that you need to complete that trip across multiple operators if necessary.
Right.
So this is very different from many of the transport software products that we use at present, which tend to be just the journey plan and then take you to an external site provider to book and pay. So it could be, if you've used Google Maps, or you might be able to click on the taxi logo or the bus provider's logo, and then you're taken to their site to continue your planning. And it's quite often that you might also have an app for a single operator that you use regularly, for example.
Right, okay.
That's also not the full package of mobility as a service, because it's just one element of your journey.
Yeah.
So it could be your bus company or a train company, or it could be a third-party product that integrates only a couple of things. Mm-hmm. So, of course, there are so many variations in this space.
Yeah.
It's impossible to cover all the possible permutations that may or may not want to call themselves mobility as a service. It's perhaps best to think of it as a sort of spectrum of products.
Right.
Because there are very few that really try to deliver the original vision, which was to have a monthly subscription for all your travel needs, with a few different bundles sort of available according to your requirements, rather than paying as you go or through a sort of week, month or season ticket that actually only covers a portion of your travel needs.
Yeah. So we're a little way off that then in terms of having that fully integrated, but there are, I guess, pockets of success. We're seeing software now that is appearing that allows you to plan. And of course, the train services, I've just had a journey to Scotland and back in the last 24 hours, and I was able to book on the train service and book a couple of train services, even though it was through one company. So there's kind of little examples of it, but it's really not that wonderful, grand, complete system that you're describing. So I guess we've got a long way to go.
Yeah. I mean, we've had the ability to book plus bus, for example, with a train ticket for a really long time.
Yeah.
I don't know that I don't have any information to hand as to whether there is much take up of that. But that ability, I have used it once or twice myself, but that ability has existed for a really long time now.
Yeah.
So, as you say, pockets.
Yeah. Now, government sort of believes that MaaS has the potential to provide quite substantial benefits, and you've touched on that just previously, and of course cost savings as well for the travelling public. So what kind of opportunities and challenges do you envisage, and is society and particularly businesses, are they ready for these kind of changes, do you think?
In relation to the benefits and cost savings for travelling public, I think, in my opinion, this is actually still unproven. I think mobility as a service is likely to be most effective in making urban transport, and in certain contexts rural transport, more efficient in terms of congestion and emissions, as well as in enabling sort of demand responsive solutions to be integrated with other modes, for example. But it really needs to be firmly underpinned by sort of MaaS transport modes, essentially public transport, with an emphasis on bus services and some support for the sort of first and last mile via the sort of more individualised modes such as micromobility where necessary. And I think we really know very little at the moment about suitable pricing models for mobility as a service. Where is the advantage over buying your tickets direct from your operator, for example, because this is a third party provider. So can you get a discount that way or not? What's in it for the operators? What's in it for the platform provider? And how does this impact on the end user? So there's still a lot that we just don't know. And I think it's really interesting that WIM, which is one of the very earliest mobility as a service thing, which did try to bundle tickets, was first launched in Helsinki by MaaS Global. And that's been regarded as the sort of role model, right? And that's just withdrawn the Helsinki service. So I think we still got a long way to go here to bottom out exactly what mobility as a service is and what it can do. So it's really difficult to say how cost savings for the travelling public would come about because of that. I do see, in terms of opportunities, because you asked about opportunities, a lot of collaborative research opportunities. So, for example, there are 2 mobility as a service deployments that are currently in their early stages in the UK. There's Breeze in the Solent Future Transport Zone, and then there's the work that's going on in the West Midlands as well. I think that's also a future transport zone. And the Highlands and Islands of Scotland through HyTrans, which is the regional transport partnership there, has a well-established trial going on called Go High, which is their mobility as a service app. That's been supported by Transport Scotland. It's been going, I think it's about 4 years now. Obviously launching in the middle of a COVID pandemic was not ideal. But there have been a lot of learnings developed from that project, and full disclosure, I was in charge of the evaluation side of that project. But what we've learned really is about some of the challenges around for the operators and the platform provider in terms of integrating APIs and in terms of understanding the different information needs of different transport modes. For example, ferries. If it's an overnight ferry, you need information about whether or not somebody wants to book a cabin, what their gender is, so you don't accidentally mismatch them. I had a hilarious incident on the Sleeper many years ago where somehow I had been booked into a cabin with a male, was not travelling with me, and it turned out that we knew each other. We were both in transport. So luckily we didn't actually have to share that cabin. They sorted it out. But that's an illustration of the sorts of sort of challenges in terms of the different operator needs for different modes that you need, and whether you need ID verification, for example, for car sharing or bike hire, for flights, things like that. We learned a lot about some of those aspects, and things tend to take longer than you anticipate, for example. And we learned a lot about how a lot of the time it takes to build trust, for example, between partners. There's a lot of complicated public-private things going on here. And, we also learned a lot about willingness to adopt this kind of really sort of innovative product. It's not for everybody yet, for example, and it's difficult to know, as it's new and hard to explain, what people who sign up for it will get out of it. Also, it's quite a deeply rural region of the UK, and it's very large and it includes islands. So there's lots of learning from that project, which hopefully will benefit everybody. At present, I think business accounts seem quite promising for mobility as a service. Having your customer is essentially the business, and their employees are sort of mandated to book all their business travel needs through your mobility as a service. I think that has a lot of potential, obviously, because it enables a single point of information for the business. They can look at the dashboard, they can see all the different modes, the cost, the climate emissions, and as more and more businesses need to report on their emissions, this is a potentially really useful tool for that. That is part of the Go High trial as well, so hopefully learnings will start to emerge from that as well. But for the wider public, I think the wholesale switch to mobility as a service, using those platforms to meet all of our travel needs, especially where private car dependence is quite deeply ingrained, I think it's a really difficult change. It involves a lot of adjustment to individual expectations and behaviours, as well as social practices around how we organise our lives collectively. And this is something that can't be fully steered, so in a sense we have to wait and see, but also it needs a policy environment which is conducive to that, which is something I'm not convinced that we've got at the moment.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, as you rightly said, there's an awful lot of research to be done before we're really in a position to roll this kind of technology out. Otherwise, it's going to be very messy, I think, in terms of particularly the general public understanding the benefits of having these kind of services. So it sounds like we've got quite a lot of work to inform and educate the public in general, but also understand the business and the technical needs to make sure that all of those platforms are in place and that they're stable before we can really roll them out. So it sounds like there's quite a lot of work to do, both technically and socially.
But we have to be willing to actually fund good long-term trials. So actually to roll them out on a trial basis, but for longer than 6 months, a year. It needs to be there for a long time, otherwise people won't rely on it.
Yeah, you kind of need a kind of a longitudinal kind of study, don't you, really, that's going to spread over a good number of years to get an understanding of people's behaviours and use of transport before you can really apply it in any meaningful way.
Yeah. So the future transport zone examples are really exciting from that point of view.
Yeah. We talked just then about the large data sets and the digital technologies that are clearly going to play a significant role in improving the efficiency of the transport system. How do you go about assessing and processing that amount of data, given, as you rightly said, the variable quality and the large numbers of stakeholders, both public and private, and of course the functional or dysfunctional, depending on which end of the scale you are, of the UK's transport network?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a data scientist.
Sure.
So I can only answer this question in quite a general way, but I know many people who are data scientists. That's how I manage it. But, one of the perceived benefits, obviously, of mobility as a service is that it can, in principle, generate a huge amount of data about trip making by its users. And that can then, in principle, be used to provide insight for the operators and for local transport authorities.
Yeah.
It can be used to enable individual users to understand their own travel patterns, their emissions, how active they are, etc., how much they're spending. Certainly a few years ago, we talked a lot about things like the quantified self in research circles, which was around, the people that like to monitor all their runs or cycles. They use Runkeeper or they use Strava, that's or they're using a diet app to monitor their food, all sorts of these are sort of instances of the quantified self, where people become managers of their own data in a sense, and they look at the data and they make adjustments to make changes so that the data looks different next time, for example, if they've got goals. So in principle, mobility as a service could do that, but in practice there's so many commercial sensitivities that act as a barrier to data sharing. Mobility as a service platforms, they don't have complete data about trip making by individuals.
Right, yeah.
So I might use a mobility as a service app, I do, but only a percentage of my trips are made using it. And so nothing is known about the rest of my trip making except by me. So the only way mobility as a service could overcome that is if it had a trip tracking function. The benefit of that might be that it could actually be quite interactive and say, there's some disruption ahead. Let me replan your journey. But that's also algorithmically quite difficult and depends on a lot of good quality data. But that would be the sort of value proposition that you would need to have for the end user in order to overcome the sort of really understandable reluctance by a lot of people to be tracked, to have their movements tracked in that way. And the sheer quantity, the volume of the data is an issue. What's the good data? What's just the chaff, the noise that's in there as well? And then the quality as for some of the sort of key data sets that we're using, like timetable data. NAPTAN, which is the national database for the locations of public transport stops. There are some inaccuracy issues in that, and it needs to be monitored very regularly to ensure that it's up to date and that things are geolocated correctly, for example. And so until we can do all of that better, we can't really unlock the full promise of a technology such as mobility as a service.
Yeah,
we don't really know whether it's cost effective to do that.
Yeah, it seems really, I don't know, that makes me feel really sad as an engineer. That we've got to overcome these other things which I guess the transport industry have been talking about for a really long time anyway. So it's not anything new. We understand that these things don't necessarily connect together. We understand people don't want to share their privacy and things like that. And these are all issues that are not just associated with transport, but associated with most things in life really now that are digitized. So we've got a lot to overcome, it sounds like, before we can really bring all of those different stakeholders together and make it useful. Now, I am someone with limited mobility. My poor old knees are getting quite bad these days in terms of being able to walk, and I have to walk with a stick quite often these days. So accessibility to me is really important. And I have to say, as much as I love Edinburgh, it has got a lot of steps. I was really struggling yesterday to get around. So I wanted to ask you about MaaS, how it might improve accessibility for people. And, there's an estimated 1.3 billion people who experience significant disability, whether it's people like me, where it's only partial, right through to people who have to use very specific services. It represents about 1 in 6 of the world's population. I had no idea it was that significant population size. While we know that things like the London tube stations are now relatively step-free, and I think all of the London buses now have got some kind of wheelchair access, there does remain, as you've pointed out, this issue with the rural stations, rural locations, and not all facilities across the UK are fully accessible to everyone, right? So is this not going to increase the cost of transport and could potentially have a reverse impact on accessibility for all if we're going to try and bring this MaaS system into place? How is that going to affect accessibility for people, do you think?
Wow, there's a lot in that question, Helen.
I'm sorry. There is. There's an awful lot.
Okay, but I am really glad that you asked me about this because it's a really, really important topic. There's been a recent report, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago now, that suggested that disabled people in the UK experience a 38% transport gap that impacts on their ability to access the things that the rest of us take for granted. And we also have an ageing population, so we can expect the numbers that are affected to actually increase over time.
Yeah.
So, this is a sort of ticking time bomb in a sense. In itself, mobility as a service can only contribute to closing the accessibility gap by improving information about accessibility to the end user.
Yeah.
That in itself is a significant problem. So, you would need to have information about the full journey And that's what mobility as a service cannot do is magically make the pavements, crossing points, buildings, vehicles, bus stations, railway stations, platforms, reliably step-free.
Yeah.
It can only give you information from the data available. So if the data's not available, it can't even give you that information. And there is an issue with the data being available, as well as the hard accessibility itself. So these issues, as you've pointed out in the case of Edinburgh and its famous steps, I used to live there. There are a lot of steps, and they are hard on the knees, and the thighs. But these are really significant accessibility barriers, as you've pointed out. Even for a simple walking journey, you need to know that it might be steep, it might have steps. Some cyclists actually need information about steepness, for example. You pointed out if a third of London tube stations are step-free, that means 2/3 are inaccessible. And we all know that buses, in general, they are wheelchair accessible in general, but the capacity is limited. You've got 2 wheelchair users, you're a bit stuck.
Yeah.
So disabled people can't always travel together. And there are conflicts with the space available on buses and on trains between parents with pushchairs and those who are using wheelchairs and other forms of mobility aids. So I don't really have the data to hand, but station accessibility as well as train accessibility is a major issue. There are far too few instances of level boarding across the UK. And it's not just wheelchair users for whom that is an issue.
Yeah.
And I believe that these things need to be addressed much faster to bring us up to standard. It's a matter of equity. And you asked about whether this would increase the cost of transport. I don't know. It might, but that's a political decision. So if the political choice was to fund accessibility by increasing the cost to the end user, then that has equity issues for those who are on lower incomes, which isn't accessibility per se, but it would reduce their access, which a different form of access, as it were.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
This is one of these other systemic, complicated issues in the transport domain. I think in terms of the physical accessibility of infrastructure and vehicles, there's a huge role for mechanical engineers. That's the upside.
Well, yes, there's certainly going to be a lot of work for engineers to do in this particular space. But again, you've really pointed out the interdisciplinary nature of this particular problem. Engineers can work on the transport equipment itself, whether it's a train or a bus or a car, but actually joining and connecting those things together is going to take all kinds of disciplines, isn't it, to really solve this problem. It's going to be and is a fantastic challenge for anyone who's looking to really solve socioeconomic problems. Here we have the transport system. I know we've talked quite a lot here about sort of the government particularly, but in the last 12 months, I think it was back in November, they published a code of practice for mobility as a service to support the industry as it's emerging, as you've been describing. And it covers a range of issues that the government believes to be most important to ensuring a fair and accessible and an innovation-friendly kind of environment. How successful do you think this is going to be in terms of this code of practice? And what can we expect to see emerging in public transport sectors over the coming years?
Oh, another big question, Helen.
We like a challenge on the podcast.
Right, what can I do with that? Okay, so, I think the Code of Practice, I think it was published in August, actually.
Oh, was it? Right.
I could be wrong, we should both go away and check this afterwards. And then you pick whichever one of us was right. But I think it was welcomed by the industry as it sets out quite clearly the government's sort of guidance in relation to what it's expecting in relation to it is, in fact, a very long list. It is a list of issues and expectations for mobility as a service. It's quite hard to digest because it is a list. I think it's too soon to say how this is going to impact on successful development of mobility as a service in the UK because it doesn't address the key underpinnings which I've mentioned before on which success is entirely dependent, which is the transport services themselves, particularly public transport. A bit of a cracked record on this one. Also, in terms of policy, more support for switching away from total dependence on private cars to nudge people towards solutions such as mobility as a service that can help make that switch more comfortable.
Yeah, sure.
Because it's the cars really which are the true competitor. And cars have their manufacturers have massive advertising budgets that have made the product so appealing.
Yeah.
You very rarely see a car advert in which the car is stuck in traffic.
That's true.
It's always driving across beautiful landscapes with not another car in sight, with the wind blowing through your hair, whatever. That's very appealing. It's very hard to make buses matching the advertising budget and getting into the public imagination is very difficult there.
Yeah.
So really it does seem quite clear that there's a bit of a mismatch as well in policy terms between promoting mobility as a service on the one hand and then coming out overtly as pro-car on the other hand. The plan for drivers was published very close in time to the code of practice. And I think there's a very mixed message there.
Yeah.
It risks undermining quite a lot of the innovations that are being carried out by local councils to reduce car dependence, which can also support social equity, where car ownership, for example, is forced because there's no alternative, and that squeezes household budgets, especially now. And it can also improve safety and quality of life in residential areas. And at the same time, makes this environment for using an app for accessing all the other forms of transport, including, short-term car rental, if that's what you need.
Yeah.
That is the sort of future that a lot of us are imagining. But the plan for drivers, I've personally found the language in the forward of that plan quite provocative and challenging. It seemed quite anti-local government. It said that they will stop, in inverted commas, well, actually that is what they said, local councils from pursuing the 15-minute city ideas, for example, because they police people's lives. That was the words that they used. And I think this kind of demonstrates a fundamental sort of misunderstanding of the nature of the problems that we have with transport and urban planning in the UK. And it serves potentially also to undermine the net zero goals as well.
Yeah.
This continued siloing of policies around different modes and transport-related innovations, it's a really significant barrier to progress in having a modern, clean, efficient and equitably affordable and accessible transport system, of which having a nice, easy-to-use, holistic mobility as a service app would be one element.
Yeah. What it says to me, and I hope to our listeners, is that we as an engineering community need to be engaging more with this, speaking up about it, bringing it into our transport community with a greater sense of urgency to start these conversations and to address some of the mismatch between government policy and the practicalities of implementing some of these ideas. So I think it sounds like there's some great challenges ahead, but equally, if we can achieve that, this is going to really change the way that we move around and interact with each other. And I think that sounds really exciting to me. So, Kate, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to seeing more of this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're welcome.
That's all for this month. In next month's episode, we will be focusing on the engineering workforce, our hybrid ways of working 3 years on after the pandemic, how the industry is addressing talent retention and attraction, and how engineering job roles are changing in a way we never anticipated. You've been listening to Impulse to Innovation, the Institution of Mechanical Engineers podcast. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear from you, so if you'd like to share any news or any feedback with us, then please email us podcast@imeche.org. All the information on this episode can be found in the episode notes.